In the far reaches of the world, where the sea meets the sky in an embrace of endless gray, there lies a land carved by the hands of ancient gods. This is a place where mountains rise like the spines of sleeping giants, their peaks crowned with eternal snow that glistens under the pale light of a sun that barely climbs above the horizon during the long winter months. Here, in these forgotten corners of the earth, the wind carries secrets from ages past, whispering through valleys and across fjords that cut deep into the rocky coastline like wounds in the flesh of the world itself. The mist rolls in from the sea each morning, a living thing that moves with purpose and grace. It drifts through the pine forests that cling to the mountainsides, wrapping itself around the ancient trees like a lover's embrace. These trees have stood for centuries, their roots digging deep into the frozen soil, their branches reaching upward toward a sky that shifts between shades of silver and violet. In the depths of these woods, where sunlight struggles to penetrate the thick canopy, moss grows in soft carpets of emerald green, and the air hangs heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The land here remembers. It remembers the footsteps of those who walked before, the warriors who carved their names into stone and legend alike. It remembers the songs sung around fires that burned bright against the darkness, the stories passed from grandfather to grandchild, each word weighted with the wisdom of survival in this harsh and beautiful realm. The very rocks seem to hold the echoes of ancient voices, and if you listen carefully in the quiet moments between one breath and the next, you might hear them still. Water flows through this landscape like blood through veins. Streams cascade down from the heights, their waters clear and cold as winter starlight. They gather in pools where trout swim in lazy circles, and they rush over smooth stones worn down by countless years of patient erosion. These streams join together to form rivers that carve their way through valleys, moving with inexorable purpose toward the sea. And the sea itself, that vast expanse of dark water, stretches out beyond the fjords to touch the edge of the world, where some say the great serpent Jörmungandr coils in the depths, waiting for the end of days. But this is not a story of endings. This is a story of a life lived between two worlds, between the realm of men and the realm of beasts, between consciousness and the wild surrender of instinct. It is a story that begins, as so many stories do, with the wind and the mist and the eternal patience of mountains that have seen empires rise and fall like waves upon the shore. In this land of ice and stone, where winter lasts for half the year and darkness reigns supreme, the people who made their homes here learned to be as hard as the land itself. They built their halls from timber hewn by hand, great longhouses with roofs of turf, and walls thick enough to hold back the brutal winds that howled down from the north. Inside these halls, fires burned day and night, their smoke rising through holes in the roof to join the clouds above. Families gathered around these fires, sharing warmth and food and the comfort of community against the cold indifference of nature. These were the Norse, the people of the north, and they understood that survival meant strength. They understood that the land gave nothing freely, that every morsel of food must be earned through labor, that every moment of warmth must be protected against the creeping cold. They learned to read the signs in the sky, to know when storms approached by the behavior of birds and the color of the clouds. They learned which plants could heal and which could kill, where fish gathered in the rivers, and when the seals came to the rocky shores to bear their young. But they learned something else as well, something that set them apart from other peoples who lived in gentler lands. They learned that there was power in the wild places, in the untamed forests and the deep waters and the howling wind itself. They learned that the old gods still walked among the trees, that spirits dwelt in every rock and stream, and that some men could reach out and touch that ancient power, could let it flow through them and become something more than merely human. These men were called berserkers, and they were both feared and revered. They were warriors who fought in a state beyond normal consciousness, who entered into a trance so complete that pain meant nothing to them, that fear could not touch them. In battle, they became vessels for something primal and terrible, something that transformed them into forces of nature as unstoppable as an avalanche, as fierce as a wildfire racing through dry forest. Some said they took on the spirits of bears, those great creatures that ruled the deep woods with strength and ferocity. Others said they became as wolves, moving with supernatural speed and coordination, hunting their enemies with a pack's deadly efficiency. The people spoke of these warriors in hushed tones around the fire when the night grew deep and shadows danced on the walls. They told stories of berserkers who waded into battle without armor, wearing only the pelts of beasts, their eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. They described how these warriors bit their shields in frenzy, how they roared with voices that seemed to come from the throats of animals rather than men. They recounted tales of berserkers who walked through storms of arrows without flinching, who broke spear shafts with their bare hands, who seemed to feel no pain even when wounded, fighting on until the battle was won or their hearts finally stilled. But the elders knew there was more to the story than simple savagery. They understood that the berserker's rage was not mere madness, but a sacred state achieved through years of training and spiritual preparation. It was a doorway opened through ritual and meditation, through the consuming of sacred herbs and the chanting of ancient formulas passed down through generations. To become a berserker was to walk a path that few could follow, a path that required absolute dedication and the willingness to surrender oneself completely to forces that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. The path began in childhood for those marked by the gods, those who showed the signs in their dreams and in their nature. These were the children who felt most at home in the forest, who seemed to understand the language of animals, who moved with an odd grace that spoke of something other than normal human coordination. The wise women and the priests could see it in their eyes, that distant look that suggested they were seeing into worlds invisible to others. These children would be taken aside and taught the old ways, the secret knowledge that had been preserved since time immemorial. And so the stage is set, here in this land of mist and mountain, of dark water and darker forests, of ancient gods and older magic. Here, where the wind carries voices from the past and the future seems to shimmer just beyond reach like heat waves on a summer road. Here, in a time when the world was younger and wilder, when men still remembered that they were part of nature rather than separate from it, our story truly begins. The fire crackles softly in the hearth, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkness. Outside, the wind whispers through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howls, its voice rising and falling like a question posed to the indifferent stars. The mist continues its eternal dance across the landscape, obscuring and revealing, hiding and showing, keeping its secrets close while promising mysteries yet to be unveiled. Rest now and let the story unfold in the theater of your mind. Let it carry you away to a time and place where magic was real, and warriors could transcend the limitations of flesh to become something wild and wonderful and terrible all at once. Close your eyes and feel the cold wind on your face, smell the smoke from distant fires, hear the crash of waves against stone cliffs. You are there, in that ancient land, watching as destiny begins to weave its threads, as a life unlike any other prepares to begin. The mountains stand eternal, patient witnesses to all that has been and all that will be. They have seen countless souls born and die, have watched kingdoms rise from nothing and crumble back into dust. They will stand long after the story has ended, after the last echo of the last battle has faded into silence. But for now, in this moment suspended between past and future, they watch and wait as a new chapter in the endless saga of the North prepares to be written. The mist thickens as night approaches, wrapping the world in soft obscurity, and in this gentle darkness, dreams begin to stir. On a night when the aurora borealis painted the heavens in ribbons of green and violet, when the stars shone with a brilliance that seemed almost painful in its intensity, a child entered the world with a cry that echoed through the small village nestled in the valley between two great mountains. The year was of no consequence, for time moved differently in those days. measured not in numbers but in seasons, in the aging of faces and the growth of children, in the cycle of planting and harvest, of freezing and thaw. The longhouse where the birth took place stood at the edge of the village, its walls thick with timber and its roof heavy with snow that had accumulated through weeks of steady winter storms. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the mingled scents of burning pine and boiling herbs. The midwife, an ancient woman whose hands had guided hundreds of children into life, worked with quiet efficiency while the mother labored in the traditional birthing chair, carved from oak and smoothed by generations of use. Outside, the father waited with the other men of the household, pacing back and forth before the fire pit that burned in the center of the village common. His name was Eric, called Eric the Steady for his calm demeanor in times of crisis, and though his face remained composed, his hands trembled slightly as he carved a small piece of wood, his knife moving in rhythmic patterns that helped to calm his racing thoughts. Around him, his brothers and cousins offered words of encouragement, recounting the births of their own children, reminding him that women had been bringing life into the world since the beginning of time. But there was something different about this night, something that the elders noticed with knowing glances exchanged in the firelight. The aurora was unusually active, dancing and swirling with an energy that seemed almost alive, almost purposeful. The dogs in the village were restless, whining and pacing, their eyes turned toward the heavens. And in the forest beyond the village boundary, wolves could be heard howling, not with the hunger or territoriality that usually marked their voices, but with something else, something that sounded almost like recognition, like greeting. The old priest, Thorvald, who served both as spiritual guide and keeper of the ancient lore, stood apart from the other men, his eyes fixed on the sky. His weathered face, marked by decades of harsh weather and harder wisdom, showed an expression of deep contemplation. He had seen many things in his long life, had witnessed omens and portents, had read signs in the flight of ravens and the patterns of frost on stone. And what he saw tonight filled him with a mixture of awe and apprehension, for he recognized the marks of divine attention, the signs that the gods themselves were watching this birth with interest. Inside the longhouse, the midwife felt it too, though she said nothing, concentrating instead on her work. The labor was progressing normally, neither unusually quick nor dangerously slow, but there was an atmosphere in the room that she could not quite name, a tension in the air like the feeling before a thunderstorm breaks. The mother, whose name was Astrid, seemed almost to glow in the firelight, her face sheened with sweat but radiating a kind of fierce determination that the midwife had seen in women at this moment countless times before, and yet somehow different, somehow touched with something extraordinary. As midnight approached, as the aurora reached its peak of brilliance, the child finally emerged into the world. The midwife caught him in practiced hands, clearing his mouth and nose, and the baby drew his first breath and released his first cry. It was a strong cry, powerful for a newborn, and in that moment the aurora seemed to pulse brighter, the wolves in the forest howled louder, and every person in the village felt a shiver pass through them, though none could have said exactly why. The midwife cleaned the child and wrapped him in soft furs, then placed him on his mother's chest. Astrid looked down at her son with wonder and exhaustion mingled in her eyes. He was a healthy baby, well-formed and vigorous, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that, even in these first moments of life, seemed to look around with unusual awareness. She held him close, feeling his small heart beating against her own, and whispered a prayer of thanks to Frigg, the mother goddess, for delivering them both safely through the ordeal of birth. When Eric was finally allowed to enter and see his wife and newborn son, he approached with steps that were at once eager and reverent. He knelt beside the bed and reached out with one rough, calloused finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. The child's fingers closed around his father's finger with surprising strength, and Eric felt something stir in his chest, a fierce protectiveness and pride that threatened to overwhelm him. He looked up at his wife, and she smiled at him, tired but content. "His name," she said softly, "will be Bjorn." The name meant bear, and it was a good name, a strong name. Eric nodded his approval, though he could not have known how prophetic that choice would prove to be, how the spirit of the bear would come to define his son's destiny in ways that transcended mere nomenclature. The priest Thorvald was called in to bless the child, as was customary. He entered the longhouse carrying his staff, carved with runes and hung with talismans that clinked softly as he moved. He stood over the mother and child, and for a long moment he simply looked at the baby, his old eyes searching, seeing something that others could not see. Then he began to chant in the old tongue, words that most in the village no longer fully understood, but that carried power nonetheless. Syllables that had been spoken over newborns for generations beyond counting. As he chanted, Thorvald traced symbols in the air above the baby's head, and he sprinkled sacred water drawn from a spring deep in the forest. Water that had never seen sunlight, water that was said to be touched by the Norns themselves, those weavers of fate who determined the course of every life. When the blessing was complete, he turned to Eric and Astrid, and his face was grave. "This child is marked," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "The gods have taken notice of him. He will walk a path that few can follow, will carry burdens that would break lesser men. But he will also know glories that are beyond the reach of ordinary souls. Raise him well, teach him honor and courage, and when the time comes, do not stand in the way of his destiny." The words hung in the air like smoke, and though neither parent fully understood what the old priest meant, they felt the weight of his pronouncement. Astrid pulled her baby closer, an instinctive gesture of protection, while Eric placed his hand on her shoulder, offering silent support and strength. In the days that followed, life in the village returned to its normal rhythms. The winter continued its slow progression toward spring, storms alternating with periods of clear, bitterly cold weather. The villagers went about their daily tasks, tending to animals, repairing tools and equipment, gathering wood for fires that burned constantly against the cold. And in Eric's longhouse, the newest member of the community grew and thrived as babies do, feeding and sleeping, and slowly beginning to perceive the world around him. But Astrid noticed things that she mentioned to no one, not even to her husband. She noticed how the baby seemed calmer when taken outside, how his eyes would track the movement of birds across the sky with an intensity unusual for an infant. She noticed how dogs approached him without fear, how even the half-wild cats that lived around the village would come and sit near his cradle, as if drawn by something they sensed in him. And she noticed his dreams, or what she assumed were dreams, the way he would sometimes move in his sleep as if running, the small sounds he would make that seemed more like the grunts and growls of animals than the noises of a human child. As winter slowly gave way to spring, as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots pushed their way through the thawing earth, Bjorn grew from newborn to infant. He was a strong baby, reaching the usual milestones earlier than expected. He held his head up early, his eyes focusing and tracking with remarkable acuity. The village women who came to visit Astrid would remark on his vigor, on the strength of his grip when he caught hold of their fingers, on the alertness in his gaze. Eric watched his son with pride and a growing sense of wonder. He had 3 daughters already, all of them healthy and bright, but there was something different about this boy, something he could feel but not quite articulate. When he held Bjorn, the child did not cry or fuss as babies often did, but instead seemed content, his small body relaxing into his father's arms with a trust that was absolute and somehow deeply moving. The summer came, brief and glorious as summers were in that northern land. The sun barely set, lingering in the sky through most of the night, casting long golden light across the landscape. The forests burst into full leaf, and wildflowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant colors. The villagers worked long hours during this precious time, harvesting, fishing, gathering, storing up provisions against the winter that would inevitably return. And Bjorn, now several months old, began to discover the world around him with increasing enthusiasm. Astrid would carry him in a sling against her body as she worked, and he would watch everything with those dark, serious eyes. He seemed particularly fascinated by the forest that surrounded the village, his gaze always drawn to the line of trees, to the shadows beneath the canopy. When the wind blew from the forest, carrying with it the scents of pine and earth and growing things, the baby would become very still, his head cocked as if listening to music only he could hear. As autumn painted the leaves in shades of red and gold, Bjorn began to crawl, and then to pull himself upright, clinging to furniture and legs and anything else he could reach. His first steps came early, and once he mastered walking, he seemed never to want to be still. He would toddle around the longhouse with determined energy, exploring every corner, touching everything within his reach. And always, whenever the door opened, he would turn toward it, toward the outside world, toward the forest beyond, as if something there was calling to him. His first word was not mother or father as might be expected, but something that sounded like a growl, a low rumbling sound that made the adults laugh nervously. His second word was clearer, Ulfr, the old word for wolf. He said it while pointing toward the forest one evening as the sun set, and in the distance, as if in answer, a wolf howled, the sound rising and falling across the darkening landscape. Thorvald, who had been watching the boys' development with close attention, came to visit Eric and Astrid when Bjorn had just passed his first year. The old priest sat by the fire, accepting a cup of warm mead, and watched the toddler play with a carved wooden horse. For a long time he said nothing, simply observing, and the parents waited with growing apprehension for whatever pronouncement he had come to make. Finally Thorvald spoke. "The time is coming," he said slowly, "when the boy will need to be taught, not the usual things that all children learn but the deeper knowledge, the old ways. He has the gift, as I suspected from his birth. He is touched by the wild, marked by the spirits of the ancient beasts. If he is to master what lives within him, if he is to become what he is meant to be, his education must begin soon." Eric and Astrid exchanged glances, and in that look passed all the hopes and fears that parents feel when contemplating their child's future. They wanted him to be safe, to be happy, to live a long and peaceful life. But they also understood, in the way that people of that time and place understood such things, that destiny could not be denied, that to try to protect their son from his true nature would be to cripple him, to make him less than he was meant to be. "When?" Eric asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Soon," Thorvald replied. "But not yet. Let him have his childhood, let him play and grow and learn the simple joys of youth. But know that when the time comes you must let him go, must allow him to walk the path that has been laid before him. It will not be easy for him or for you, but it is the way of things. Some are born to tend fields and others to sail ships, some to craft tools and others to make music. Your son was born to be a warrior, but not an ordinary one. He will be berserker, a bridge between the world of men and the realm of beasts, and that is both a gift and a burden beyond measure." The fire crackled and the wind whispered around the eaves of the longhouse, and Bjorn, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation, continued to play, making the wooden horse gallop across the floor, accompanying its journey with sounds that were part child's play and part something else entirely, something wild and free, and just a little bit dangerous. The years passed like water flowing over smooth stones, each season blending into the next in the eternal cycle that governed life in the northern lands. Bjorn grew from toddler to boy, his body stretching upward like a young pine tree reaching for sunlight. By his 7th summer, he stood taller than most boys his age, with broad shoulders that hinted at the powerful frame he would develop in manhood. His hair remained dark, the color of raven wings, and his eyes held depths that seemed older than his years. He was a quiet child, given more to observation than to idle chatter. While other children played their games of warriors and monsters, shouting and laughing with carefree abandon, Bjorn often stood at the edge of the group, watching with an intensity that some adults found unsettling. It was not that he was unfriendly or withdrawn, but rather that he seemed to be listening to something the others could not hear, seeing things invisible to normal sight. The forest called to him with a voice that grew stronger with each passing year. Whenever his chores were complete, whenever he could slip away from the watchful eyes of adults, he would make his way to the tree line, and then into the green shadows beyond. At first his mother, worried, would send his older sisters to fetch him back, but Thorvald counseled patience. "Let the boy wander," the old priest said. "The forest is his teacher now, and there are lessons there that no human can provide." And so Bjorn wandered, following game trails that wound between ancient trees, crossing streams by leaping from stone to stone, climbing to high places where he could look out over the canopy and see the distant mountains rising against the sky. He learned the forest as a blind man learns to read by touch, every tree and rock becoming familiar, every sound and scent catalogued in his memory. He knew where the deer came to drink in the early morning, where the bears marked their territory on the bark of favored trees, where wolves denned in hidden caves. The animals of the forest grew accustomed to his presence. Deer would raise their heads when he passed but would not bolt in panic. Birds would land in branches near him, cocking their heads and regarding him with bright, curious eyes. Once, he came upon a mother bear with cubs, a situation that would send most humans running in terror, but the bear simply looked at him, sniffed the air, and then continued teaching her young ones how to turn over logs in search of grubs. Bjorn stood motionless, watching, and something passed between them, some understanding beyond words. It was during one of these forest wanderings, when Bjorn was 8 years old, that he first experienced the dreams in waking. He had been following a stream, mesmerized by the play of sunlight on water, when suddenly the world seemed to shift around him. The colors became more vivid, the sounds more clear. He could hear the heartbeat of the forest, could feel the life pulsing through every root and branch. And then, standing before him on the opposite bank of the stream, he saw the wolf. It was larger than any wolf he had seen before, its coat a mix of gray and silver that seemed to shimmer in the dappled light. Its eyes were amber, bright and intelligent, and they fixed on Bjorn with an intensity that should have been frightening, but instead felt strangely comforting, like coming home after a long journey. Boy and wolf regarded each other across the flowing water, and in that moment Bjorn felt something shift within himself, felt walls he had not known existed begin to crumble. The wolf spoke, not with words but with images and feelings that flooded into Bjorn's mind. He saw himself running on 4 legs, felt the wind in his fur, tasted the hot blood of prey. He experienced the joy of the pack, the fierce loyalty that bound them together, the thrill of the hunt and the satisfaction of the kill. But beneath these surface sensations lay something deeper, a vast and ancient consciousness that stretched back beyond memory, back to a time when the world was young and gods walked freely among their creations. When Bjorn's normal awareness returned, he found himself on his knees in the shallow water, gasping as if he had been running for miles. The wolf was gone, if it had ever truly been there, and the forest had returned to its ordinary state. But Bjorn knew, with a certainty that penetrated to his bones, that something fundamental had changed within him. A door had been opened, and what lay beyond that threshold both terrified and exhilarated him. He told no one of this experience, but Thorvald seemed to know regardless. The old priest began to watch him with even greater attention, and soon after he came to Eric and Astrid to say that the time had come to begin Bjorn's true education. And so, as summer waned toward autumn, the boys' formal training commenced. Thorvald's home stood apart from the other buildings of the village, a small structure built near a grove of ancient oaks that the people considered sacred. Inside, the single room was cluttered with the paraphernalia of his calling. Bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, stones carved with runes, wooden idols of the old gods, bones and feathers and mysterious objects whose purposes were known only to the priest himself. The air smelled of smoke and aged wood and something else, something that might have been called magic if such a word could encompass the subtle energies that permeated the place. Bjorn came here each day as the sun reached its zenith, when shadows were short and the light was at its strongest. Thorvald would be waiting, sometimes sitting by the fire, sometimes standing at a table where he ground herbs or mixed preparations whose purposes he did not immediately explain. The lessons began simply with stories. The old priest had a gift for storytelling, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to something deeper. He told of the creation of the world, of how the gods slew the giant Ymir and made the earth from his flesh, the mountains from his bones, the sea from his blood. He spoke of Odin, the All-Father, who sacrificed his eye for wisdom and hung upon the world tree for 9 nights to learn the secrets of the runes. He described the great battles between gods and giants, the tricks of Loki, the strength of Thor, the beauty of Freya, and the maternal wisdom of Frigg. But interwoven with these familiar tales were other stories, older and stranger. Thorvald spoke of the time before the gods, when the spirits of nature ruled unchallenged, when every tree and stone and stream had its own consciousness, its own will. He told of the first shamans, those who learned to walk between worlds, to journey in spirit while their bodies remained behind. And he spoke of the berserkers, the warriors who were not quite human, who could open themselves to possession by animal spirits and become living weapons of terrifying power. There are different kinds of strength, Thorvald explained one afternoon as rain drummed against the roof and wind rattled the door. There is the strength of the body which can be built through training and discipline. There is the strength of the mind which comes from knowledge and experience. But there is a third kind of strength, older and more primal, and it is this strength that flows through you, young Bjorn. It is the strength of the wild, of tooth and claw, of instinct untempered by thought. It is the fury of the storm and the patient power of the earth. To access this strength, you must learn to let go, to surrender yourself, to become a channel for forces that are greater than any individual. The boy listened, absorbing every word, every nuance of meaning. He was a good student, quick to understand and eager to learn, but Thorvald sensed that true comprehension would come not from words but from experience. And so, as autumn deepened and the nights grew longer, the lessons began to include practical exercises. Thorvald taught Bjorn to sit in stillness, to quiet his mind and sink into a state of deep meditation. At first the boy found this difficult, his young body restless, his thoughts jumping from one thing to another like a grasshopper. But gradually, with practice, he learned to settle into the silence, to find the still point at his center from which he could observe his own thoughts without being caught up in them. From this foundation of meditation, they moved to more advanced practices. Thorvald showed Bjorn how to regulate his breathing, how to use the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation to alter his state of consciousness. He taught him to visualize, to create detailed mental images so vivid they seemed almost real. He introduced him to the concept of the spirit journey, explaining how the consciousness could separate from the body and travel to other realms, places that existed alongside the physical world but could not be reached by ordinary means. These teachings were accompanied by the use of sacred plants, herbs that grew in hidden places and were gathered with ceremony and respect. Some of these were burned as incense, their smoke altering perception and opening doors in the mind. Others were brewed into teas that tasted bitter but produced subtle shifts in awareness. Thorvald was careful with these tools, using them sparingly and always in safe, controlled circumstances, for he knew that the realms they revealed could be dangerous to navigate without proper guidance. Under the influence of these preparations, Bjorn began to have visions. He would sit before the fire, gazing into the flames, and see images moving in the dancing light. He saw great halls where warriors feasted eternally, where mead flowed like rivers and the battle was never truly over because the dead rose each morning to fight again. He saw the world tree, Yggdrasil, its roots reaching down into the depths and its branches stretching up to touch the homes of the gods. He saw the 3 Norns sitting at the base of the tree, weaving the threads of fate, measuring out the length of each life with impartial precision. And he saw the animals, great spirit beasts that were more than their physical counterparts, that embodied the pure essence of their species. He saw the wolf, wise and fierce, running through forests that had never known the axe. He saw the bear, powerful and patient, moving through its territory with the confidence of absolute dominion. He saw the eagle, soaring above the world, seeing everything from a perspective that humans could only imagine. These spirit animals seemed to recognize him, to acknowledge some connection that he did not yet fully understand. As winter closed in and snow piled deep around the village, Thorvald began to tell Bjorn about the specific tradition he was being prepared to join. The berserkers, he explained, had existed since time beyond memory. They were warriors, yes, but they were also priests of a sort, servants of the old powers, men who had learned to become vessels for the raw fury of nature itself. There are rituals, Thorvald said, his voice low and serious, ceremonies that have been passed down through generations. These rituals prepare the body and mind for transformation. They involve fasting and feasting, pain and pleasure, isolation and community. They are not easy, and not everyone who attempts them succeeds. Some are driven mad by the experience, their minds shattered by forces too great for them to contain. Others lose themselves entirely, become more beast than man, unable to return to human consciousness. But those who succeed, those who can walk the line between worlds without falling into the abyss on either side, they become something extraordinary. The old priest paused, studying the boy's face in the firelight. Bjorn met his gaze steadily, showing no fear, only an intense curiosity and a readiness that seemed beyond his years. "You have the gift," Thorvald continued. "I saw it the night you were born, saw it confirmed in every year of your growth. The spirits have marked you, have claimed you as their own. But having the gift is not enough. You must also have the discipline to control it, the wisdom to know when to surrender and when to hold back, the courage to face what you will become without flinching. The path of the berserker is lonely, for you will always be apart from other men, always standing with one foot in their world and one in the realm of the wild. Can you accept this?" Bjorn did not answer immediately. He was young, but he had already learned the value of considered response, of thinking before speaking. He looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and shift, and he thought about his life, about the forest that called to him, about the wolf he had seen by the stream, about the dreams that visited him in the night. He thought about the normal life he might have lived, the path of farmer or fisherman or craftsman, the simple pleasures of an ordinary existence. And he knew, with a certainty that came from the deepest part of himself, that such a life was not meant for him, that he had been born for something else. "I can," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I will walk this path wherever it leads. I will become what I am meant to be." Thorvald nodded slowly, and in his ancient eyes was a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, for he knew what lay ahead for this boy, knew the trials and transformations that awaited him. But he also knew that Bjorn had spoken truly, that this was indeed his destiny, and that no power in the 9 realms could turn him from it now. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the small house, and in the forest beyond the village, wolves sang their chorus to the winter moon. And Bjorn, sitting by the fire in the home of his teacher, felt something shift and settle within him, felt the first threads of his fate being woven into a pattern that would define not just his life but his very being. The whispers of the ancient gods had become clear voices, and he was finally ready to truly hear what they were saying. The ceremony was to take place on the night of the winter solstice, when darkness held dominion over the world for the longest stretch, when the boundary between realms grew thin and spirits walked more freely among the living. It was a time sacred to the old gods, a moment when the year died and was reborn, when endings and beginnings merged into a single eternal point. For a boy about to undergo his first true transformation, there could be no more appropriate time. The preparation began 3 days before the solstice. Bjorn, now in his 13th year, had grown into a strong youth, his body lean and hard from years of training in the forest. Thorvald came to Eric's longhouse at dawn and led the boy away, carrying only a small bundle of supplies. They walked in silence through the village and into the forest, following paths that Bjorn knew well but that seemed somehow different now, charged with an energy he had never noticed before. Deep in the woods, in a place where few villagers ventured, there stood an ancient stone circle. The stones were old beyond reckoning, placed there by people whose names had been forgotten long before the Norse arrived in these lands. They were weathered and moss-covered, but they still stood, arranged in a perfect ring around a flat central space where no grass grew. This was where the ceremony would take place, where Bjorn would either succeed in his transformation or fail, and Thorvald did not speak of what failure might mean. The first day was dedicated to purification. Bjorn was instructed to remove his clothing and stand in the center of the circle, while Thorvald built a small fire and heated water mixed with sacred herbs. The old priest then washed the boy from head to foot, chanting in the old tongue, words that spoke of cleansing and preparation, of making the body a fit vessel for what was to come. The water was cold, drawn from a stream that flowed from deep within the earth, and the herbs stung where they touched his skin, but Bjorn stood motionless, accepting the discomfort as part of the process. After the washing, he was given new clothing, a simple tunic and trousers made from undyed wool, and a cloak of bear fur that had been prepared specially for this occasion. The bear had been hunted with ceremony, its spirit honored and thanked for the sacrifice, and the pelt had been cured using methods passed down through generations of shamans and spirit workers. When Bjorn wrapped it around his shoulders, he felt a tingle run through his body, as if the spirit of the bear still lingered in its fur, recognizing in him a kindred essence. That night he ate no food, drinking only water and a mild tea that Thorvald prepared. Sleep was difficult, for the cold penetrated even through the bear cloak, and he lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest around him. He heard owls calling, their voices rising and falling in eerie conversation. He heard something large moving through the underbrush, probably a deer or perhaps a bear itself, drawn perhaps by some instinct to witness what was about to unfold. And he heard the wind moving through the trees, a constant whisper that seemed to be speaking words just below the threshold of understanding. The second day began with meditation. Thorvald sat across from Bjorn before a small fire, and together they sank into the deep stillness that the boy had learned over years of practice. But this meditation was different, more intense, more focused. Thorvald guided him with his voice, describing a journey through darkness, down through layers of consciousness, past the everyday thoughts and concerns, past memories and dreams, down to a place that existed before words, before thought itself. Here, in this primal darkness, lay the source of transformation, the place where human and animal met and merged. Time ceased to have meaning. Bjorn might have sat for hours or for minutes, he could not have said. He was aware of his body only as a distant thing, a shell that housed his consciousness but did not define it. He felt himself expanding, his awareness spreading out to encompass the forest around him, the earth beneath him, the sky above. He could feel the slow pulse of the trees as they stood in their winter dormancy, waiting for spring's return. He could sense the sleeping animals in their dens, their heartbeats slow and steady. And he could feel something else, something vast and old and powerful, watching, waiting, assessing whether he was ready. When he emerged from the meditation, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thorvald was looking at him with an expression that might have been approval or might have been concern. It was hard to tell in the fading light. The old priest fed him a small amount of food, just enough to keep his body functioning but not enough to satisfy his hunger. The hunger was important, he explained, for it made the body more receptive, more open to the changes that were coming. That night was harder than the first. The hunger gnawed at Bjorn's belly, making sleep even more elusive. He dozed fitfully, drifting in and out of dreams that were vivid and strange. In one, he was running through the forest on 4 legs, his body low to the ground, his senses sharp and clear. He could smell the trails of other animals, could hear the rustle of prey in the underbrush, could feel the power in his muscles as they bunched and released with each stride. In another dream, he stood upright as a man but with the head of a bear, looking down at the village from the forest's edge, feeling a deep affection for the people there, but also an awareness of his own separateness, his status as something other. The third day, the day of the solstice itself, dawned cold and clear. The sky was a pale blue, almost white, and the sun seemed to struggle to rise above the horizon, as if reluctant to begin its brief journey across the winter sky. Thorvald woke Bjorn before full light and led him down to a stream where ice formed along the edges, leaving only a narrow channel of flowing water in the center. Here, Bjorn was instructed to immerse himself completely, to submerge his body in water so cold it felt like knives against his skin. He did not hesitate. He had learned that hesitation was the enemy of transformation, that commitment must be absolute. He waded into the stream and then ducked beneath the surface, feeling the cold slam into him with brutal force. Every instinct screamed at him to get out, to seek warmth, but he held himself under until his lungs burned and spots danced before his eyes. Only then did he rise, gasping, his body shaking violently. Thorvald wrapped him in furs and led him back to the stone circle, where a larger fire had been prepared. As Bjorn warmed himself, the old priest began to prepare the sacred drink, the mixture that would open the final door, that would allow the transformation to occur. He worked in silence, grinding dried mushrooms that had been gathered in secret places, mixing them with honey and various herbs whose names he did not speak aloud. The resulting liquid was dark and thick, and it smelled of earth and decay and something else, something that might have been magic. As the sun reached its zenith, as short-lived as that zenith was on this, the shortest day of the year, other figures began to emerge from the forest. They were the elders of the village, the wise women and the warriors who had themselves walked the path of transformation, who understood what was about to take place. They arranged themselves around the stone circle, outside the ring of standing stones, forming a larger circle of human witnesses. They said nothing, but their presence added weight to the moment, a sense of gravity and importance. Thorvald beckoned Bjorn forward. The boy stood before him, and the old priest placed his hands on Bjorn's shoulders, looking deep into his eyes. "What you are about to do," Thorvald said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "cannot be undone. Once you drink this and open yourself to the transformation, you will be changed forever. You will never again be wholly human, will always carry within you the presence of the beast. There will be times when the boundary between your human self and your animal nature grows thin, times when you must fight to maintain control. There will be moments of glory and moments of terror. The path you are choosing is not an easy one. Are you certain this is what you want?" Bjorn did not hesitate. "I am certain," he said, and his voice was steady. Thorvald nodded and handed him the cup. The liquid inside was warm, almost hot, and it looked like nothing Bjorn wanted to put in his body. But he raised it to his lips and drank it down in several long swallows, forcing himself not to gag at the bitter, earthy taste. When the cup was empty, he handed it back to Thorvald and stood waiting, unsure what to expect. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The old priest gestured for him to sit, and he lowered himself to the ground before the fire, crossing his legs and trying to remain calm. The elders around the circle began to chant, a low rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Thorvald added herbs to the fire, and smoke rose in thick clouds, swirling around Bjorn, filling his lungs with strange scents. Then the changes began. Subtle at first, just a warmth spreading through his belly, a tingling in his limbs. But quickly it grew stronger, more intense. His heart began to pound, faster and faster, until he thought it might burst from his chest. His skin felt too tight, as if his body were trying to expand beyond its boundaries. Colors became more vivid, sounds sharper. He could hear the breathing of each person around the circle, could smell their individual scents, could feel the vibration of their chanting through the ground beneath him. The fire before him seemed to grow larger, or perhaps he was falling into it, he could not tell. The flames reached up like hands, like claws, beckoning him forward, inviting him to leap into their burning embrace. He felt himself moving toward them, though whether he was actually getting up and walking or whether this was happening only in his mind, he could not have said. And then everything shifted. The world tilted sideways and Bjorn was falling, tumbling through darkness that was absolute and endless. He tried to cry out but had no voice, tried to flail his arms but had no body. He was consciousness without form, awareness without anchor, and he was terrified. But then in the darkness, two eyes appeared. Great amber eyes that glowed with their own light, that looked at him with recognition and welcome. The wolf. The spirit wolf he had seen by the stream all those years ago. It moved toward him through the darkness, and as it approached, it seemed to grow larger, or perhaps he was growing smaller, until it stood over him like a mountain, vast and ancient and powerful beyond measure. The wolf opened its mouth, and Bjorn expected to be devoured, but instead he was drawn inside, pulled into the wolf's being, and suddenly he was the wolf. He felt his body change, felt his spine curve, felt his hands and feet become paws, felt his face push forward into a muzzle. Fur sprouted across his skin, thick and warm. His senses exploded with information, smells and sounds that he had never imagined flooding into his awareness. But he was still himself. He was Bjorn and he was the wolf, and somehow he was both at once, two consciousnesses occupying the same space, merged but distinct. He could feel the wolf's wildness, its hunger and its fierce joy in simply being alive, in running and hunting and existing in the moment with no thought for past or future. But he could also feel his own human awareness, his ability to think and plan and remember, his connections to family and community and culture. He ran. In his transformed state, whether it was physical or purely spiritual he could not say, he ran through the forest with a speed and grace that would have been impossible in his human form. He leaped over fallen logs, dodged between trees, splashed through icy streams. The world was alive with scent trails, with the marks of territory, with the invisible highways that animals traveled. He could read the forest like a book written in a language he had always known but never quite understood until now. How long he ran, he did not know. Time had no meaning in this state. But gradually, slowly, he became aware of Thorvald's voice, calling him back, guiding him home. It was difficult to return, difficult to give up the freedom and power of the wolf state, but he trusted his teacher, and he followed that voice like a thread leading through a maze. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on his back in the center of the stone circle, staring up at a sky filled with stars. The sun had set while he was in his trance and night had fallen. The fire had burned down to coals and the elders were gone, though he had no memory of them leaving. Only Thorvald remained, sitting beside him, watching with patient eyes. Bjorn tried to speak but found that his voice would not work. His body felt strange, disconnected, as if he were wearing it like clothing that did not quite fit. Thorvald helped him to sit up and offered him water, which he drank gratefully. The old priest said nothing, simply waited for the boy to find his equilibrium, to settle back into his human form and human consciousness. Finally, after what might have been minutes or hours, Bjorn found his voice. "Did it work?" he asked hoarsely. Thorvald smiled, and in that smile was satisfaction and pride. "Look at yourself," he said, gesturing. Bjorn looked down at his hands and saw that his fingernails had grown longer, had become almost like claws. His arms were covered with scratches and dirt, as if he had actually been running through the forest. And on the ground around him were tracks, paw prints pressed into the soft earth, far too large to belong to any normal wolf. "You transformed," Thorvald said softly. "Your body remained here in the circle, but your spirit took the form of the wolf and ran wild through the forest. The elders witnessed it, saw your body change, saw the wolf spirit inhabit your flesh. You are berserker now, truly and completely. The door has been opened and it can never be closed again." Bjorn felt tears running down his face, though he could not have said whether they were tears of joy or fear or simple overwhelm. He had done it. He had crossed the threshold, had become what he was meant to be. But Thorvald was right. He could feel it already. the presence of the wolf within him, not separate but part of him now, forever woven into the fabric of his being. They sat together through the night, as the stars wheeled overhead and the temperature dropped to bitter depths. Thorvald spoke quietly, offering guidance and reassurance, explaining what Bjorn could expect in the days and weeks to come. The transformation would become easier with practice, he said, more controlled. But it would also be dangerous, for the line between human and beast was always thin, and it would be easy to lose himself on the wrong side of that line. As dawn approached, as the sky began to lighten in the east, they gathered their few possessions and prepared to return to the village. Bjorn felt exhausted, drained in a way that went beyond mere physical fatigue. But beneath the exhaustion was something else, a deep sense of rightness, of having taken his proper place in the grand pattern of existence. They walked slowly through the forest, and Bjorn noticed that the animals did not flee from their approach as they usually did. A fox watched them pass from a safe distance, its bright eyes curious. Birds called from the trees, and their songs seemed to carry meaning that Bjorn could almost understand. The forest had accepted him, had acknowledged him as kin, and that acceptance filled him with a quiet joy that needed no words to express. The years that followed the first transformation were years of learning and refinement, of testing the boundaries of what Bjorn had become and developing the discipline to control it. He was no longer simply a boy from the village, no longer an ordinary youth who would grow into a farmer or fisherman. He was berserker, and that title carried with it responsibilities and challenges that would have broken a lesser person. Thorvald became more than a teacher during this time. He became a guide, a guardian, and in many ways a second father. The old priest understood what Bjorn was experiencing, for he himself had walked a similar path in his youth, though his gift had led him toward the mysteries of healing and spirit work rather than the way of the warrior. But he knew the dangers, knew how easy it would be for Bjorn to lose himself in the wildness, to let the beast consume the man until nothing human remained. The training took place primarily at night under the light of moon and stars. There were practical reasons for this. The village needed to sleep, and the sounds and sights of a young berserker learning his craft would have been disturbing at best, terrifying at worst. But there were also spiritual reasons. The night belonged to the old powers, to the spirits and the wild things. Under darkness, the boundary between worlds grew thin, making transformation easier, more natural. They would meet at the stone circle, or sometimes in other places deep in the forest where even the bravest hunters rarely ventured. Thorvald would build a fire, small and contained, just enough to provide light without dispelling the essential darkness. And then the work would begin. At first, the focus was on learning to enter the transformed state at will, without the need for sacred drinks or elaborate ritual. This was harder than it sounded. The first transformation had been facilitated by preparation and ceremony, by the herbs and the fasting and the intense focus of many days. Now Bjorn needed to learn to find that state through intention alone, to open the door between human and animal consciousness with nothing but will and practice. Thorvald taught him breathing techniques, patterns of inhalation and exhalation that altered the chemistry of his blood, that changed his state of consciousness in subtle but significant ways. He taught him postures and movements, ways of holding his body that seemed to invite the animal spirit to step forward. And most importantly, he taught him to surrender, to let go of the human need for control, and allow the transformation to happen naturally, like water finding its level. It took weeks of practice before Bjorn could reliably enter the transformed state without external aids. The breakthrough came on a night when the moon was full, its light flooding the forest with a silver radiance that seemed almost alive. Bjorn had been trying for hours, following all the techniques Thorvald had taught him, but nothing was happening. Frustration built within him, and with it came tension, which only made the transformation more difficult. Finally, exhausted and discouraged, he simply gave up trying. He sat down on a fallen log and let his mind go blank, not meditating exactly but simply existing in the moment, aware of the cool night air on his skin, the scent of pine and earth, the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. And in that moment of complete surrender, it happened. The world shifted, his senses expanded, and he felt the wolf spirit merge with his consciousness as naturally as breathing. He looked at Thorvald and saw the old man not just with human eyes but with the enhanced perception of the wolf. He could see the heat radiating from his body, could smell the individual components of his scent, could read in the subtle shifts of posture and expression things that would have been invisible to normal human perception. And when he spoke, his voice came out as a low growl that nonetheless carried meaning. "Good," Thorvald said, showing no surprise or alarm at Bjorn's changed state. "Now return." That was harder. The transformed state was intoxicating, filled with power and clarity that made ordinary human consciousness seem dull and limited by comparison. But Bjorn focused on Thorvald's voice, used it as an anchor, and slowly, carefully, he pulled himself back into his human form. When he was fully himself again, he was trembling with effort and exhilaration. "The hardest part," Thorvald said quietly, "is not the transformation itself but the return. The beast does not want to give up control once it has tasted freedom. You must always remember that you are the master, that the wolf is a part of you but does not define you. If you ever lose that understanding, if you ever let the animal completely take over, you may not find your way back." From that night forward, Bjorn practiced the transformation every day, sometimes multiple times, until it became as natural as flexing a muscle. He learned to shift partially, taking on only certain aspects of the beast while maintaining his human form and reason. His senses would sharpen, his reflexes quicken, his strength increase, but he would remain fundamentally himself, able to think and plan and make choices. This partial transformation, Thorvald explained, was the true skill of the berserker warrior. In battle, a complete transformation would be impractical, would remove the ability to work with other warriors, to follow commands, to adapt to changing circumstances. But by maintaining the core of his humanity while channeling the power of the beast, Bjorn could become something greater than either human or animal alone, a fusion that combined the best of both. As his control improved, the training expanded to include combat. Eric, Bjorn's father, had taught him the basics of fighting as all Norse boys learned, the use of sword and axe, spear and shield. But now those lessons were revisited from a new perspective. Thorvald brought in warriors from the village, men who had experience in raiding and battle, and they worked with Bjorn to help him learn how to integrate his berserker abilities with practical fighting skills. The warriors were initially skeptical and somewhat afraid. They had heard stories of berserkers, knew them as figures of legend, but none had actually trained with one before. The first few sessions were awkward, the warriors holding back, uncertain how to react to the young man who moved with inhuman speed and struck with impossible strength. But gradually, as Bjorn learned control, as he demonstrated that he could modulate his power and pull his strikes, they began to work with him more seriously. They taught him tactics and strategy, how to read an opponent's movements, how to conserve energy during a prolonged fight, how to work as part of a shield wall or a raiding party. And Bjorn taught them in turn, showing them what it was like to face an opponent who could not be intimidated, who felt no pain, who fought with the single-minded ferocity of a wild animal. The training was not without accidents. More than once, Bjorn lost control, the excitement of combat pushing him too far into the transformed state. Shields were splintered, weapons broken, and on one memorable occasion, a warrior named Gunnar ended up with a broken arm when Bjorn moved faster than any human should be able to move and struck with force that shattered bone despite the padding they wore for practice. After that incident, Bjorn was devastated, convinced that he was too dangerous, that he should abandon his training before he killed someone. But Gunnar, his arm splinted and bound, sought him out and told him something that Bjorn never forgot. "Pain heals," the warrior said, his face calm despite the injury. "Bones knit back together. What you have, young Bjorn, is a gift that comes once in a generation. Yes, it is dangerous. Yes, you must learn control. But do not mistake a single moment of lost control for a fundamental flaw. Every warrior injures his training partners. I have broken bones and had mine broken more times than I can count. This is no different. You will master this, and when you do, you will be a weapon such as the world has rarely seen. Do not give up. The words steadied Bjorn, gave him the resolve to continue. He redoubled his efforts at control, learned to recognize the signs that he was slipping too far into the beast state, developed triggers that he could use to pull himself back. And slowly, steadily, his skill grew. Thorvald also taught him the spiritual dimensions of his gift. Being a berserker was not just about physical prowess, about becoming a more effective killing machine. It was about understanding the connection between all living things, about honoring the spirits of the animals whose power he channeled, about maintaining the balance between civilization and wilderness that allowed both to thrive. On nights when the moon was dark, when the forest was at its most mysterious and unknowable, Thorvald would take Bjorn to sacred places, groves and springs and caves where the old gods were still worshipped. Here they would make offerings, leaving food and drink and small tokens of craftsmanship for the spirits. They would sit in silence and meditate, opening themselves to visions and messages from the otherworld. Sometimes the spirits would speak, not with voices that could be heard with physical ears, but with impressions and feelings, with images that appeared in the mind's eye. They would show Bjorn things, glimpses of possible futures, warnings about dangers to come, reassurances that he was on the right path. And Bjorn learned to listen with more than his human senses, to perceive with the intuition of the beast, to trust in knowledge that came from sources beyond ordinary understanding. The seasons turned, winter giving way to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, and autumn back to winter again. 3 full cycles of the year passed in this way, with Bjorn training constantly, pushing himself to master every aspect of his gift. His body changed, growing stronger and harder, developing the kind of wiry strength that came from constant use rather than mere size. His face, too, changed, losing the softness of youth, becoming more angular and defined, with eyes that held a depth of experience unusual in one so young. The village watched his development with a mixture of pride and unease. They were glad to have a berserker among them, for such warriors were valuable beyond measure in times of conflict. But they also saw how different he had become, how set apart from normal human concerns. He had friends among the young men of the village, certainly, and he was always respectful to his elders, always dutiful to his family. But there was a distance to him now, an otherness that even those closest to him could feel. His mother, Astrid, felt this distance most keenly. She had known from his birth that her son was special, marked by powers beyond her understanding. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were different things. She watched him walk into the forest each night to train, watched him return with eyes that sometimes held a feral glint, watched him sit at meals with the family but seemed to be listening to sounds no one else could hear. She loved him fiercely, as mothers do, but she also grieved for the normal life he would never have, for the simple pleasures that were now beyond his reach. Eric, his father, dealt with the situation in his own way. He was proud of his son, spoke of him to other men with obvious satisfaction, but he also understood the weight that Bjorn carried. On rare occasions when they were alone, he would speak to his son about responsibility, about duty, about the importance of using strength wisely and with restraint. These were not easy conversations, for Eric was not a man comfortable with deep emotional expression, but Bjorn valued them nonetheless, treasured these moments when his father treated him as a man rather than as something strange and other. By the time Bjorn reached his 16th year, he was fully trained. He could enter and exit the transformed state at will, could modulate his power with fine precision, could fight with devastating effectiveness while maintaining enough control to avoid harming allies. He knew the lore of his calling, understood the spirits and the old ways, could perform the necessary rituals and read the appropriate signs. In short, he was ready to fulfill his destiny as a berserker warrior. It was at this time that visitors came to the village, warriors from a jarl who ruled lands to the south. They were seeking men for a raid, a voyage across the sea to distant shores where monasteries held treasures and where the people were said to be soft, unprepared for the fury of Norse warriors. It was an opportunity for glory and wealth, for young men to prove themselves and return home with silver and stories. Thorvald came to Bjorn one evening as the preparations for the raid were being discussed. The old priest looked at his student with eyes that held both satisfaction and sadness, the mixed emotions of a teacher seeing his pupil ready to leave the safety of instruction for the dangers of the real world. "Your time has come," he said simply. "You have learned all I can teach you. Now you must go out into the world and discover what you will become when your training meets reality. The path of the berserker is not walked in forest clearings and village practice yards. It is walked on the field of battle, in moments of life and death when there is no time for thought, only action." Bjorn nodded slowly. He had known this moment was coming, had been preparing for it even as he trained. But knowing and experiencing were different things, and he felt a flutter of nervousness in his belly, a very human uncertainty about what lay ahead. "Will I see you again?" he asked. Thorvald smiled, and in his ancient face was warmth and affection. "If the Norns will it," he said. "But whether you return to this village or not, know that you carry my teachings with you always. You are Berserker Bjorn Eriksson, and that is both your burden and your glory. Walk your path with honor, fight with courage, and never forget that beneath the beast, you are still human, still connected to the people and the land that shaped you." That night Bjorn stood at the edge of the forest, looking up at the stars that wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. The moon was waxing toward full, its light casting shadows through the trees. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, and Bjorn felt the answering call rise in his own chest, felt the familiar surge of power that came with the transformed state. But he did not surrender to it. Instead, he simply stood, breathing in the cold night air, feeling the earth solid beneath his feet, and he prepared himself mentally and spiritually for the journey to come. He would go with the raiders, would cross the sea to unknown lands, would test himself in the crucible of battle, and he would discover whether all his training, all his discipline, all his years of walking between human and beast had truly prepared him for what he was meant to become. The stars offered no answers, only their cold and distant light. But that was enough. Bjorn turned and walked back toward the village, toward his family and his home, to spend his last night before departure in the warmth and comfort of the familiar. Tomorrow would bring change, would bring danger and opportunity in equal measure. But tonight he would rest, would gather his strength, would hold close the memories of all he had been taught and all he had learned. The forest watched him go, and the wolves sang their chorus to the moon, and the world turned steadily on its axis, carrying them all toward whatever futures the Norns had woven into the great tapestry of fate. The longship that would carry them across the sea was a magnificent vessel, crafted by master shipwrights who understood the sacred relationship between wood and water. Its strakes were cut from oak that had been selected with care, trees that had grown straight and tall in forests consecrated to the old gods. The planks overlapped in the traditional clinker style, fastened with iron rivets and sealed with tarred wool, creating a hull that was both flexible and strong, able to ride the waves rather than fighting against them. The prow curved upward in an elegant sweep, carved into the shape of a dragon's head that was both beautiful and fierce. This figurehead was not merely decorative. It served a spiritual purpose, meant to frighten away malevolent spirits and to announce to any who saw the ship that these were warriors, men not to be trifled with. During harbor time, the dragon head would be removed and stored carefully, for it was considered unlucky and disrespectful to the local spirits to display such aggressive imagery while at rest in friendly waters. Bjorn stood on the shore with the other men who would make the voyage, watching as supplies were loaded into the ship's belly. There were chests of weapons and armor, carefully wrapped and stored where they would remain dry. There were barrels of dried fish and salted meat, bags of grain and dried fruits, enough provisions to last for weeks if the voyage proved difficult. There were water skins and ale barrels, for the sea air made men thirsty and a dry throat made for poor morale. And there were personal items, the small treasures and necessary tools that each man deemed important enough to carry into unknown lands. The crew numbered 30 men, a number considered lucky and practical in equal measure. 30 men could row the ship in shifts, allowing half to rest while half worked, maintaining a sustainable pace across long distances. 30 men could form a formidable fighting force, neither so large as to be unmanageable nor so small as to be vulnerable. And 30 was a number that appeared repeatedly in the old stories, in the tales of heroes and their companions, giving the voyage a sense of continuity with the legendary past. The Jarl who led this expedition was named Sigurd, a man in his middle years with a reputation for both ferocity in battle and fairness in dealings with his warriors. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his beard going gray but his arms still corded with muscle, his eyes sharp and assessing. When he looked at Bjorn, he did so with a mixture of curiosity and calculation, for word of the young berserker had reached him, and he was eager to see if the reality matched the rumors. "You are Eric's son," Sigurd said, his voice carrying the rough authority of one accustomed to command. "The one they call beast-touched." Bjorn met his gaze steadily, showing neither pride nor shame. "I am Bjorn," he said simply. "I will fight for you with all that I am." Sigurd studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "I have heard of your kind," he said. "Berserkers are valued among warriors, for they can turn the tide of battle when all seems lost. But they can also be dangerous, to enemies and friends alike if not properly controlled. Can you control it, the beast within?" "I can," Bjorn replied, and in his voice was quiet certainty. "I have trained for many years. I know my limits and how to maintain them." "Good," Sigurd said, "because on a ship there is no room for loss of control. We are bound together, all of us, our fates intertwined. If one man fails, we all may suffer. Do you understand?" "I understand," Bjorn said. Sigurd clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of acceptance, and then moved on to inspect other preparations. Bjorn watched him go, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. This was different from training, from controlled practice in familiar surroundings. This was real, with real consequences, and the knowledge both excited and sobered him. As the sun climbed toward midday, the final preparations were completed. The ship was provisioned and ready, the crew assembled on the shore. Families gathered to say farewell, wives and mothers and children clinging to men who might not return, warriors maintaining stoic faces while privately wondering if they would ever see their homes again. Such was the way of these voyages, the mingling of hope and fear, of glory-seeking and the very real possibility of death in foreign waters or on hostile shores. Astrid embraced her son, holding him tightly for a long moment. She said nothing, for what was there to say? She had known this day would come, had watched him prepare for it through all his years of training. But knowing did not make the letting go any easier. When she finally released him, her eyes were wet but she did not weep openly, showing the strength that Norse women were known for, the ability to endure hardship and loss with dignity. Eric gripped Bjorn's forearm in the warrior's clasp, their eyes meeting in mutual understanding. "Fight well," his father said. "Honor the family and yourself, and come home if the Norns allow it." "I will," Bjorn promised, though he knew it was a promise that might be beyond his power to keep. Thorvald was there as well, standing apart from the families, leaning on his staff. When Bjorn approached him, the old priest placed a hand on his head in blessing, murmuring words in the old tongue that Bjorn could not quite make out but that he felt settle into his bones like warm honey. When the blessing was complete, Thorvald pressed something into Bjorn's hand, a small carved figure of a wolf, worn smooth by age and handling. "For protection," the priest said quietly, "and for remembrance. Whatever happens out there, remember who you are and where you come from. The beast is strong, but the man must be stronger." Bjorn closed his fingers around the carving, feeling its familiar shape against his palm, and nodded his thanks, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak. Then it was time. The men waded into the cold water, pushing the longship out from the shore until it floated free, then pulling themselves aboard with practiced ease. The oars were unshipped, fitted into the locks, and at Sigurd's command the crew began to row. The ship moved smoothly through the water, picking up speed as the rowers found their rhythm, their oars rising and falling in perfect synchronization. Bjorn took his place among the rowers, though his position was toward the stern, near where Sigurd stood at the steering oar. As a berserker, he would not be expected to row for the entire journey, would be held in reserve for when his particular skills might be needed. But for now, he pulled his weight alongside the others, feeling the burn in his muscles as the ship moved out of the fjord and toward the open sea. The families on shore grew smaller as the distance increased, waving hands becoming mere specks, the village itself shrinking until it was just a collection of buildings clustered against the mountain's base. Bjorn watched until he could no longer distinguish individual figures, until the land itself began to fade into the distance, and then he turned his face forward, toward the unknown horizon that awaited them. The journey across the sea was unlike anything Bjorn had experienced before. On land, even in the deepest forest, there was always a sense of place, of belonging to a specific location. But on the open water, there was only the endless expanse of waves, the dome of the sky above, and the ship that carried them, a small wooden island of humanity in a vast and indifferent ocean. The weather was good at first, the wind favorable, allowing them to raise the great square sail that had been woven by the women of the village with prayers and blessings worked into every thread. The sail caught the wind, billowing out with a satisfying snap, and the ship surged forward, the oars drawn in as they let the elements do the work. Men relaxed at their benches, some telling stories, others playing at dice or checking their weapons, passing the time as sailors have done since the first humans ventured onto water. Bjorn found the motion of the ship strangely soothing. The rise and fall of the deck beneath his feet, the constant sound of water rushing past the hull, the cry of seabirds that followed in their wake, all of it worked together to create a rhythm that felt almost meditative. He spent hours simply watching the water, seeing the light play across the waves, noting the subtle changes in color that indicated shifts in depth or current. At night, when the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the stars emerged in all their glory. Away from land, with no fires to compete with their light, they shone with an intensity that took the breath away. The men would navigate by these stars, by ancient knowledge passed down through generations, knowing which lights to follow, which constellations marked the path to their destination. Bjorn lay on the deck, wrapped in his cloak, looking up at that vast display, feeling very small and very mortal beneath the eternal heavens. But not all was peaceful. 3 days into the voyage, a storm rose from the north, dark clouds rolling in with frightening speed, the wind shifting from gentle breeze to howling gale in what seemed like moments. The crew sprang into action, reefing the sail, securing everything that might be washed overboard, taking their places at the oars to keep the ship's head into the waves. The storm raged through the night and into the next day, waves crashing over the bow, wind tearing at the rigging, rain falling in sheets that made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The ship rode the mountainous seas, climbing up one side of each wave and sliding down the other, sometimes seeming to hang suspended between water and sky before crashing back down with jarring force. Men belayed constantly, using buckets to throw water back over the side as fast as it came in, knowing that if they fell behind, if the ship took on too much water, they would all be dragged down into the cold depths to join the countless sailors who had perished on this road before them. They worked in shifts, their arms aching, their hands raw from gripping the rough wood of the buckets, but they did not stop, could not stop, for to stop was to die. Bjorn felt the fear around him, the very human terror of men facing forces far greater than themselves. But he also felt something else, the wild exhilaration that the storm evoked in the beast part of his nature. The fury of wind and wave called to something primal within him, made him want to roar back at the storm, to match its violence with his own. He held himself in check, maintaining control, but it was difficult, required constant effort to keep the transformation at bay. Sigurd noticed. The Jarl stood at the steering oar, his face streaming with water, his entire focus on keeping the ship from being broadsided by the waves. But even in that moment of crisis, he saw the way Bjorn stood braced against the motion of the ship, saw the tension in his body, the feral gleam that came and went in his eyes. And when their gazes met, Sigurd gave a small nod, an acknowledgement of the struggle Bjorn was engaged in, and perhaps a measure of respect for the control he was maintaining. The storm lasted for 2 days and a night before finally blowing itself out, the clouds breaking up and dispersing, the wind calming to more reasonable levels. The crew was exhausted, half of them collapsing in sleep where they sat as soon as the danger had passed. They had lost some supplies, a barrel of water and several bags of provisions washed overboard, but the ship itself was intact, and all the men had survived. In the grand scheme of things, it was a good outcome, though it did not feel that way to bodies battered by the storm and minds worn thin by constant vigilance. They made repairs where necessary, rested as best they could, and continued on. The days began to blur together, each much like the last, a routine of rowing when the wind was poor, sailing when it was favorable, eating simple meals, sleeping in shifts, and always moving forward toward their destination. Bjorn spent much of this time in conversation with the other warriors, learning about them, their hopes and fears, their reasons for taking this journey. Some sought wealth, plain and simple, hoping to return home with enough silver to buy land or ships of their own. Others sought glory, the chance to prove themselves in battle and earn names that would be remembered in songs and stories. Still others were simply restless, unable to settle into the quiet life of farming or fishing, needing the excitement and danger that only raiding and warfare could provide. He became particularly friendly with a warrior named Orn, a man several years older than Bjorn who had been on raids before. Orn was a practical sort, neither particularly brave nor particularly cowardly, simply a competent warrior who knew his business and did it well. He took a liking to the young berserker, perhaps seeing in Bjorn's seriousness a reflection of his own pragmatic nature. The key to surviving battle, Orn told him one evening as they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red, is not to be a hero. Heroes die young and are celebrated in songs, but they are still dead. Better to fight smart, to stay with your companions, to know when to press forward and when to fall back. Glory is fine, but living to spend your plunder is better. Bjorn smiled at that, appreciating the no-nonsense wisdom. What about berserkers? He asked. Do we die young? Orn considered the question seriously. Some do, he admitted. Those who lose themselves entirely to the beast, who fight without any thought for their own survival. But those who maintain control, who can channel the fury without being consumed by it, they can become legendary. I've seen it once. A berserker who fought like 10 men but who also knew when the battle was lost, when it was time to retreat and live to fight another day. He was old when I knew him, scarred beyond counting but still alive, still sharp in his mind. That's what you should aspire to be. The words stayed with Bjorn, reinforcing lessons that Thorvald had taught him. Power was nothing without wisdom, strength meaningless without discipline. He resolved to be like the old berserker Orn had described, to survive not just his first battle but many battles, to become a warrior who inspired respect rather than just fear. As the journey continued, Bjorn began to feel a change in the air, a sense that land was near though none was yet visible. The seabirds that had been their occasional companions became more numerous, and the color of the water shifted subtly, suggesting shallower depths. The crew grew more alert, more focused, sensing that their destination was approaching. And then, on the morning of the 14th day since leaving home, someone called out from the prow, "Land! I see land!" All eyes turned forward, straining to see what the lookout had spotted. There on the horizon was a dark line that was not sea or sky but solid earth, the coast of the strange land they had come so far to reach. A cheer went up from the crew, relief and excitement mixing together. The tedium and danger of the voyage suddenly worthwhile now that the goal was in sight. Sigurd stood at the steering oar, his face showing satisfaction. "Ready yourselves," he called to the crew. "Tonight we rest and make final preparations. Tomorrow we go ashore and we take what we came for. Tomorrow we prove ourselves as warriors." The men responded with shouts of agreement, weapons raised in salute, the anticipation of battle and plunder driving away the last vestiges of exhaustion from the long voyage. They were raiders, and this was what they were born to do. Bjorn felt his pulse quicken, felt the beast within him stir in anticipation. He reached into his pouch and touched the carved wolf that Thorvald had given him, drawing comfort from its familiar shape. Then he began to mentally prepare himself for what was to come, reviewing his training, considering the lessons he had learned, making ready for the moment when theory would meet practice, when he would finally discover what kind of warrior he truly was. The ship moved steadily toward the shore, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would unfold when these men from the north met whatever resistance this foreign land might offer. The saga was about to truly begin. They made landfall in a sheltered cove as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, guiding the longship carefully between rocky outcroppings that could tear open a hull if approached carelessly. The water here was calmer than the open sea, protected from the worst of the wind and waves by the curve of the land itself. As the ship's keel scraped against sand and gravel, men jumped over the sides and began hauling it further up the beach, working together with practiced efficiency until the vessel was secure, beyond the reach of the tide. The beach was composed of smooth stones worn down by countless years of water's patient work, interspersed with patches of coarse sand that crunched beneath their boots. Above the high tide line, the land rose in a gentle slope, covered with tough grasses that bent and swayed in the constant wind. Beyond that was forest, different from the pines and firs of home, with trees that Bjorn did not recognize, their branches spreading wide and their leaves already showing the colors of autumn. While some men set about establishing a camp, others were sent to scout the surrounding area. They needed to know what lay inland, whether there were settlements nearby, whether they had been observed making landfall. The success of their raid depended on surprise and speed, on striking before the locals could organize a defense or send word to larger forces that might be in the region. Bjorn was among those chosen to scout. Sigurd had looked at him thoughtfully before making the selection, perhaps thinking that a berserker's enhanced senses might prove useful for such work. Bjorn was paired with Orn and two other warriors, men who had proven themselves capable and level-headed in the past. They gathered what they needed, leaving behind their heavy war gear in favor of lighter equipment that would allow them to move quickly and quietly. And then they set out, moving inland as the last light of day began to fade from the sky. The forest here felt different from the woods of home. The trees were spaced differently, the undergrowth denser in some places and more sparse in others. The sounds were unfamiliar, birds calling with voices Bjorn had never heard, insects making rhythms that were subtly wrong to ears accustomed to northern forests. But the fundamental nature of woodland was the same wherever you went, and Bjorn found himself quickly adapting, reading the signs that nature provided, following game trails, and noting the markers that indicated human activity. They moved carefully, stopping frequently to listen and observe, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of threat or opportunity. The light failed gradually, the forest growing darker, shadows deepening between the trees. But Bjorn's eyes, touched by the beast within him, adapted more quickly than those of his companions. He could see with greater clarity in the dimness, could pick out details that others might miss. After perhaps an hour of careful progress, they smelled smoke. It was faint, just a hint carried on the evening breeze, but it was unmistakable. Somewhere ahead, someone had lit a fire. The scouts exchanged glances, then proceeded with even greater caution, moving slowly and carefully, placing their feet with precision to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves that might give away their presence. The source of the smoke revealed itself gradually. Through the trees, they began to see a flickering orange glow, and as they drew closer, they could make out the shape of buildings, a small settlement of perhaps a dozen structures. The buildings were different from Norse longhouses, constructed of stone and timber with thatched roofs, arranged around what appeared to be a central courtyard. Lamplight showed in some of the windows, and they could hear voices, the sound of people going about their evening routines, unaware that danger watched from the forest's edge. But what drew Bjorn's attention most strongly was another building, set slightly apart from the rest. It was larger than the others, built with more care and obvious skill, and it featured a tall structure that rose above the roofline, topped with what appeared to be a cross. Even in the darkness, something about the building suggested importance, suggested wealth. A monastery. It had to be. They had heard of these places, communities of holy men who devoted their lives to their strange god, who kept treasures of gold and silver, who lived lives of peace and were unprepared for violence. Such places had been raided before with great success, for the monks rarely fought back, and their treasures were often poorly guarded, protected more by religious sanctity than by practical defenses. The scouts withdrew carefully, making their way back to the beach to report their findings. By the time they arrived at the camp, full night had fallen, and the raiders had established themselves well. Tents had been erected for those who had them, though most men simply prepared to sleep under the stars, wrapped in cloaks against the cool night air. A large fire had been built in a pit dug in the sand, the flames dancing and crackling, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. Sigurd listened to their report with intense focus, asking detailed questions about the settlement's layout, the number of buildings, the monastery's location relative to the other structures. He questioned them about signs of military presence, about whether they had seen anyone who might be a warrior or soldier rather than a simple farmer or monk. When he was satisfied that he had extracted every useful detail, he dismissed them to get food and rest. The camp had taken on a particular atmosphere that Bjorn would come to recognize in later raids, the mixture of excitement and tension that preceded battle. Men checked their weapons obsessively, sharpening blades that were already sharp, adjusting straps on shields, making small repairs to armor. They spoke in low voices, their conversations a mixture of boasts and genuine nervousness, bravado and honest fear. Some laughed too loudly at jokes that were not particularly funny, while others sat in silence, staring into the fire, their thoughts turned inward. Bjorn found himself a place near the fire, accepting a portion of dried fish and hard bread from the common supplies. The food was not particularly good, but he ate mechanically, fueling his body more than satisfying any real hunger. His mind was already turning toward the next day, toward what would be required of him, toward the transformation that he would need to embrace. Orn settled down beside him, his own meal in hand. For a time they ate in companionable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the conversations flowing around them. Finally, Orn spoke, his voice quiet enough that only Bjorn could hear. "First time?" he asked. Bjorn nodded. "First real battle," he confirmed. "I've trained, practiced against other warriors, but never with the intention to actually kill, to face someone who is truly trying to kill me." "It's different," Orn agreed. "All the training in the world can't quite prepare you for the reality of it. The smell of blood and shit, because men lose control of their bowels when they die. The sounds, the screaming and begging. The way it feels when your blade cuts into flesh, the resistance and then the give as it slides between ribs or severs muscle. It stays with you, changes you. You'll never be quite the same after tomorrow." "Are you trying to frighten me?" Bjorn asked, though there was no accusation in his tone, only curiosity. "No," Orn said. Just being honest. You seem like someone who values truth over comfortable lies. The thing is, you'll adapt. Humans are good at that, at adapting to things that seem impossible to endure. The first kill is hard, but it gets easier. Maybe too easy if you're not careful. That's something to watch out for, losing the weight of it, starting to think of other people as nothing more than obstacles or sources of plunder. Bjorn considered this, appreciating the older warrior's wisdom. How do you maintain the balance? He asked. How do you do what needs to be done without losing your humanity? Orn was quiet for a moment, thinking. I remember that the people we raid, they're not so different from us, he said finally. They love their families, they fear death, they want to live and prosper just like we do. We're taking from them, hurting them, maybe killing them, but we don't have to enjoy it. We can do what we must without celebrating the suffering we cause. And we can show mercy where it's practical, where it won't put us at greater risk. Not every raid has to end with everyone dead. Sometimes taking what you came for and leaving is enough. These words resonated with Bjorn, aligned with teachings that Thorvald had given him about maintaining balance, about not letting the beast completely consume the man. He was grateful for Orn's perspective, for this practical wisdom that complemented the more mystical instruction he had received from the old priest. As the evening wore on, Sigurd moved among the men, speaking to each group, offering words of encouragement and outlining the plan for the next day. When he reached Bjorn and Orn, he squatted down beside them, his weathered face serious in the firelight. Tomorrow will test us all, he said, but I expect it will test you particularly, young Bjorn. You'll need to use your gift to become what you were trained to become. The berserker's fury can break the spirit of defenders, can turn a difficult fight into a rout. But you must remember that you fight alongside these men, not apart from them. Can you do that? Can you unleash the beast while still maintaining enough control to be part of the larger strategy? I can, Bjorn said with confidence he hoped was justified. I've trained for exactly this. I won't lose myself and I won't endanger our own men. Sigurd studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you, he said, and I'm glad to have you with us. But know this, if at any point I judge that you're becoming a danger rather than an asset, I'll have men ready to pull you back, to restrain you if necessary. Nothing personal, just practical necessity. I understand, Bjorn said, and he did. It was actually reassuring to know that Sigurd had thought through the potential problems and had contingencies in place. It showed wisdom and careful planning, qualities that made for a good leader. After Sigurd moved on to speak with other groups, Bjorn rose and walked away from the fire, needing some time alone with his thoughts. He made his way to the water's edge, where wavelets lapped gently at the stones, reflecting starlight in shifting patterns. The longship sat nearby, pulled up on the beach, its dragon-headed prow silhouetted against the sky like some great beast at rest. He stood there for a long time, feeling the cool night air on his face, listening to the eternal rhythm of the sea. Tomorrow he would kill men. Tomorrow he would embrace the beast fully, would let it guide his actions in ways that might horrify the civilized part of himself. Tomorrow he would discover whether all his training had truly prepared him for what it meant to be berserker. Behind him, he heard soft footsteps on the stones. He turned to find that several other warriors had followed him, not to interrupt his solitude but to engage in their own pre-battle rituals. Some knelt in prayer, calling upon the gods for strength and protection. Others simply stood like Bjorn, staring out at the water, perhaps thinking of home and loved ones, perhaps contemplating their own mortality. One man, older than most of the others, began to sing softly. It was an old song, one that Bjorn recognized from his childhood, a song about warriors preparing for battle, about the glory of dying well and earning a place in Valhalla where the brave feasted eternally. Other voices joined in, the sound rising and falling, not loud enough to carry far but providing comfort and solidarity to those who sang. Bjorn did not sing, but he listened, letting the familiar words wash over him, finding in them a connection to all the warriors who had gone before, all who had stood as he stood now, on the edge of violence and change. He was part of something larger than himself, part of a tradition that stretched back beyond memory, and that knowledge steadied him, gave him strength. Eventually, he returned to the fire, wrapped himself in his cloak, and lay down to rest. Sleep came surprisingly easily, despite the anticipation of what morning would bring. Perhaps it was exhaustion from the long voyage and the scouting expedition. Perhaps it was the peace that came from accepting what must be faced rather than fighting against it. Or perhaps it was simply the gift of youth, the ability to sleep when sleep was needed regardless of circumstance. He dreamed, but not the usual confused jumble of images and emotions that characterized most dreams. This was something different, more coherent, more real. He was in the forest, running on four legs, his wolf form moving with fluid grace through the darkness. But he was not alone. Other wolves ran beside him, a pack united in purpose, their minds linked in ways that transcended individual consciousness. They were hunting, pursuing prey that remained always just ahead, tantalizingly close but never quite within reach. The chase went on, through terrain that shifted and changed, sometimes forest, sometimes open plain, sometimes rocky mountains that they climbed with impossible ease. And always, just at the edge of perception, there was something else, some presence that watched and judged, measuring his worth, determining whether he was ready for what was to come. When he woke, the first light of dawn was just beginning to color the eastern sky, painting it in shades of pink and gold. Around him, other men were stirring, rising from their sleep, preparing themselves for the day ahead. The fire had burned down to coals during the night, but someone was already rebuilding it, adding wood and coaxing flames back to life so that men could warm themselves and heat water for morning porridge. Bjorn sat up, feeling remarkably clear-headed and rested despite the significance of the day. He moved through his morning routine with deliberate calm, eating a simple breakfast, checking his equipment, performing the small rituals that helped center his mind and prepare his spirit. He spoke little, conserving his energy and focus for what was to come. Sigurd called the men together as the sun cleared the horizon, its light streaming across the water and illuminating the beach where they had camped. The Jarl stood before them, a commanding presence, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly to every man present. "Today we take what we came for," he said. "Today we prove ourselves as warriors, as raiders, as men worthy of the name Viking. The target is rich and poorly defended. If we strike hard and fast, if we maintain our discipline and work together, we will succeed. We will return to our ships laden with treasure, with glory, with tales to tell our children and grandchildren." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze moving across the assembled warriors, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "But remember this," he continued. "We are not mindless savages. We are warriors with honor. Fight fiercely, yes. Kill those who resist, absolutely. But do not torture, do not rape, do not destroy for the sake of destruction alone. Take what is valuable, eliminate threats, and then we leave. Clean, efficient, professional. This is how men of worth conduct themselves." The warriors murmured their agreement, nodding at the wisdom of these words. A reputation for excessive brutality might bring short-term fear, but it would also inspire desperate resistance and unite enemies against them. Better to be known as dangerous but not cruel, as warriors to be respected rather than monsters to be destroyed at any cost. "Prepare yourselves," Sigurd finished. "We move out within the hour. May the gods favor us this day." The men dispersed to make their final preparations, donning armor, checking weapons one last time, saying whatever prayers or performing whatever rituals they felt necessary. Bjorn found a quiet spot away from the main group and began the process of opening himself to the transformation, not fully embracing it yet, but preparing the pathway, making sure that when the moment came, he would be ready. He breathed deeply, slowly, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong. He reached out with his awareness to the beast within, acknowledging its presence, welcoming it without surrendering control. He visualized the battle to come, saw himself moving through it with purpose and power, striking down enemies while protecting allies, becoming an instrument of his companions will rather than a wild force that might harm friend as readily as foe. When he opened his eyes, he found Orn watching him from a short distance away. The older warrior gave him a nod of encouragement and a slight smile, then turned to his own preparations. Bjorn felt a wave of gratitude for that simple gesture, for the unspoken support it represented. The sun climbed higher. The time for waiting was over. The time for action had arrived. The approach to the settlement was conducted in silence, 30 men moving through the forest with the careful stealth of hunters stalking wary prey. They had left the beach behind as the sun climbed toward its zenith, following the path that the scouts had marked the previous evening. Sigurd led them, his movements confident and assured, while experienced warriors were positioned throughout the column to maintain order and discipline. Bjorn walked near the front, where Sigurd had placed him deliberately. The plan was for Bjorn to be among the first to enter the monastery, to use his berserker fury to break any initial resistance and create the shock and terror that would make the rest of the raid easier. It was a sound tactical decision, using the right tool for the right purpose, but it placed enormous responsibility on Bjorn's shoulders. As they drew closer to the settlement, Bjorn began the process of transformation. Not fully, not yet, but opening himself incrementally to the beast within, allowing it to rise gradually toward the surface of his consciousness. His breathing deepened, became more rhythmic. His senses sharpened, colors becoming more vivid, sounds more distinct. He could smell the settlement now, wood smoke and cooking food, animals and humans, the characteristic scent of human habitation. The change that was occurring within him was both familiar and strange. Familiar because he had done this countless times in training, had learned the pathways and the process through years of dedicated practice. Strange because this time was different. This time there would be real enemies, real violence, real consequences. The beast knew the difference, could sense it, and it stirred with anticipation and hunger. They reached the forest's edge and paused, hidden in the shadows beneath the trees, looking out at the settlement bathed in late morning sunlight. From this vantage point, they could see people moving about their daily business, unaware of the danger that watched from the woods. Women tended gardens, men worked at various crafts, children played in the open spaces between buildings. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, and for a moment Bjorn felt a pang of something that might have been guilt or might have been doubt. But then Sigurd was moving, gesturing for the men to spread out to take their assigned positions. The time for hesitation was past. This was what they had come to do, and it would be done. Bjorn pushed his doubts aside, letting them sink beneath the rising tide of the beast's consciousness. There would be time later for reflection and perhaps regret. Now there was only the present moment, the task at hand, the transformation that must be completed. The signal came, a whistle like a bird call that would mean nothing to the settlers, but that every raider recognized. And then they were moving, breaking from the cover of the trees, running toward the settlement with weapons drawn, voices raised in war cries that were meant to terrify and disorient. This was the moment Bjorn let go. The transformation crashed over him like a wave, sudden and complete. His consciousness shifted, tilted, reformed into something that was both himself and not himself. The human part of his mind receded, became a distant observer, while the beast surged forward to take control. But unlike a true animal which operates on pure instinct, Bjorn's beast self retained purpose and direction, understood the goal, knew friend from foe. His vision changed, the world becoming sharper and clearer, details jumping out with almost painful precision. He could see the individual threads in people's clothing, could count the leaves on distant trees, could track multiple moving objects simultaneously. His hearing expanded, catching sounds that would have been inaudible before, separating them, analyzing them, extracting information from the chaos. And the strength that flooded through his muscles was intoxicating, a sense of power so complete that he felt he could tear down walls with his bare hands, could run forever without tiring, could fight entire armies alone. It was glorious and terrible, this power, and he understood in that moment why some berserkers lost themselves to it, why they could not find their way back to humanity once they had tasted this godlike might. But he held on. Beneath the beast, the core of Bjorn remained, maintaining the essential control that kept him from becoming a mindless killing machine. He was berserker, yes, but he was also warrior, also comrade, also part of a larger whole that depended on coordination and discipline. He ran toward the monastery, faster than any normal human could run, his feet barely seeming to touch the ground. Other warriors followed, but they seemed to move in slow motion compared to his enhanced speed. He reached the monastery's main door while the settlers were still processing what was happening, still frozen in shock at the sudden appearance of armed raiders. The door was heavy wood, banded with iron, meant to be secure, but to Bjorn in his transformed state, it was nothing. He hit it with his shoulder, putting all his enhanced strength into the impact, and the door shattered, wood splintering, the iron bands tearing free of their mountings. He burst through into the interior, and the transformation completed itself. He was no longer running on 2 legs but on 4, no longer human in form but something else, something caught between man and beast. His body had not physically changed, not truly, but the way he moved, the way he carried himself, the emanations that came from him, all of it spoke of the bear, of that great creature whose spirit he channeled. Inside the monastery, monks were scrambling, some trying to flee, others standing frozen in terror. One, braver or more foolish than the rest, stepped forward with a staff raised, perhaps thinking to defend his brothers or simply unable to overcome his instinct to stand his ground. Bjorn saw him, processed him as a threat, and responded with the bear's casual, devastating power. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, knocked the staff aside with one hand, and struck with the other. The blow would have killed an ordinary man, but Bjorn, maintaining just enough control, pulled it slightly, his fist connecting with the monk's chest with enough force to send him flying backward but not to completely shatter his ribcage. The monk hit the far wall and slumped to the floor, unconscious but alive. Other raiders poured in behind Bjorn, and now the systematic looting began. They moved through the monastery with practiced efficiency, seeking out the treasury, the areas where valuables would be stored. Some monks tried to hide, others tried to flee, but they were rounded up and herded into the main hall, where they could be watched and prevented from raising any organized resistance. Bjorn moved through it all like a force of nature, his presence alone enough to quell most resistance. When he entered a room, people recoiled, their instinctive fear of predators overwhelming any thoughts of fighting back. He was aware of himself on multiple levels, the beast reveling in the power and fear, the human noting details and maintaining the thread of control that kept him from going too far. They found the treasury, a room secured behind a heavy door that took several men working together to break open. Inside were chests and boxes containing exactly what they had hoped for, church treasures accumulated over years, perhaps decades. There were items of gold and silver, crosses and plates and chalices worked with exquisite craftsmanship. There were coins, both local currency and foreign gold that represented wealth beyond what most of the raiders had ever seen in one place. There were holy books with covers encrusted with jewels, manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf and precious pigments. The raiders loaded these treasures into sacks and bags they had brought for the purpose, working quickly and efficiently. Outside, they could hear shouting, the sounds of the rest of the settlement reacting to the raid. Some of the local men were attempting to organize resistance, gathering whatever weapons they could find, preparing to defend their homes and families. Sigurd, coordinating the operation with practiced skill, sent runners to check on the various groups of raiders, ensuring that everyone was adhering to the plan, that no one was getting carried away and causing unnecessary destruction or casualties. When he encountered Bjorn, still in his partially transformed state, he looked at him with assessment and satisfaction. "Good," Sigurd said simply. "You've done well, but we need to start withdrawing. Can you maintain control as we retreat, or do you need to come down now?" Bjorn, his voice coming out as a growl that nonetheless formed words, managed to communicate that he could maintain it, that he would cover the retreat. Sigurd nodded and moved on, issuing orders, organizing the withdrawal. The retreat was conducted in stages, with some warriors pulling back while others maintained defensive positions, then leapfrogging so that there was always a line between the settlement and the escaping raider.